I sat in that sterile Denver family courtroom, my hands gripping the wooden bench until my knuckles turned white, listening to words I never imagined would be spoken about me. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as my own parents' attorney stood before Judge Morrison, declaring me mentally incompetent and incapable of managing my own affairs. My mother Patricia and father Gerald wanted legal guardianship over my $78,000 savings account and the downtown apartment I had purchased at 26. Their lawyer Randolph Sterling presented what he claimed were medical records showing I suffered from severe bipolar disorder and gambling addiction. Sterling's smirk stretched across his face like he had already won the case before it began. Judge Morrison flipped through the initial documents, while my hands trembled uncontrollably, the devastating realization hitting me that my own parents had orchestrated this elaborate scheme to steal everything I had worked for since graduating college. Surveillance report this morning. Bradley knows what to say when he testifies, and Eleanor has been practicing her landlord story. The only problem is that court-appointed attorney. She's asking for more money than we originally agreed to pay her. End quote. The recording continued with Patricia's reply, quote, "Pay whatever Sarah Kim demands. We need her to sabotage his defense completely or this whole plan falls apart. Once we get the guardianship approved, we'll have access to his entire savings account plus the apartment equity. We can afford to be generous with our co-conspirators." End quote. Judge Morrison's expression transformed from curious interest to shocked recognition as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Sterling was frantically shuffling through papers, clearly unprepared to defend against evidence of the elaborate fraud he had been helping to orchestrate. Gerald had buried his face in his hands, while Patricia sat frozen in her chair like a deer caught in headlights. "Officer Sullivan," Judge Morrison said grimly, "please read the second item." The second document contained printed screenshots of email correspondence between Gerald and Marcus Webb, the private investigator who had been conducting surveillance on my daily activities. Sullivan read the exchanges that revealed detailed planning of the fraudulent evidence gathering and coordination between multiple participants in the conspiracy. Email from Gerald Calhoun to Marcus Webb, dated September 28th. Quote, "We need surveillance photos that can be interpreted as evidence of paranoid behavior and social isolation. Focus on capturing images when he's alone, preferably looking over his shoulder or appearing agitated. The bank has agreed to provide modified statements showing large cash withdrawals during late-night hours." End quote. Webb's response email was equally damning. Quote, "I've been documenting his routine for 6 weeks now. The subject maintains normal daily patterns, but I can photograph him from angles that suggest suspicious behavior. Eleanor Finch has agreed to pose as his former landlord, and I'm preparing damaged apartment photos from a separate property to support her testimony. The subject appears stable and responsible, so we'll need to be creative with our evidence presentation." End quote. Judge Morrison was visibly disturbed by the evidence of coordinated perjury and fraud, but Sullivan's announcement of the third item caused him to recoil physically and immediately call for courtroom security. The bailiff's voice carried a note of shock as he described what he was seeing. "Your Honor," Sullivan said, his professional composure shaken, "the third item is a handwritten document that appears to outline plans for long-term institutionalization and permanent asset seizure. The writing matches previous samples from Patricia Calhoun, and the content describes intentions that go far beyond standard guardianship arrangements." Sullivan began reading Patricia's handwritten plan, which detailed not just the immediate guardianship fraud, but their long-term strategy for maintaining complete control over my life indefinitely. The document revealed plans to have me declared permanently incompetent and committed to a psychiatric facility where I would remain under heavy medication to ensure docility and compliance. Quote, "Once the guardianship is approved, we'll sell his apartment immediately and transfer the proceeds to our retirement account. The savings account funds will cover our gambling debts and cryptocurrency losses. We've researched long-term care facilities that accept patients with severe mental illness, and Sunset Manor has agreed to keep him indefinitely as long as we continue making monthly payments." End quote. The most shocking revelation came in Patricia's notes about medication management. Quote, "Dr. Harrison at Sunset Manor confirmed that patients receiving high doses of antipsychotic medications rarely recover enough cognitive function to challenge their commitment orders. We'll need to ensure Calhoun's treatment includes maximum sedation levels to prevent him from attempting legal action or contacting outside advocates who might question his diagnosis." End quote. Judge Morrison stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger, as he realized the true scope of the conspiracy. Bailiff call for immediate security presence in this courtroom. We're dealing with attempted kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy charges that require immediate detention of the primary participants. Patricia and Gerald sat frozen as courthouse security officers entered the room, clearly understanding that their elaborate scheme had collapsed completely. Sterling was rapidly packing his briefcase, apparently hoping to distance himself from his clients before the full legal consequences became clear. Quote, "If necessary, we can arrange for Calhoun to have an accident during his transport to Sunset Manor." Patricia's notes continued. Dr. Harrison mentioned that patients sometimes experience adverse reactions to initial medication doses, especially when combined with anxiety about their new living arrangements. An overdose could be explained as suicide attempt by someone unable to accept their mental health diagnosis. End quote. The final revelation caused several people in the courtroom to gasp audibly. My parents hadn't just been planning to steal my assets and freedom. They had been considering murdering me if their institutionalization plan encountered legal challenges. The scope of their betrayal extended beyond financial fraud into potential homicide. Judge Morrison was calling for additional security personnel and requesting immediate contact with law enforcement agencies specializing in fraud and conspiracy cases. Sterling had abandoned his clients entirely, walking quickly toward the courtroom exit, while Patricia and Gerald remained seated, apparently too shocked to move or speak. Officer Sullivan continued reading through additional evidence in my folder, including recorded conversations where my parents discussed bribing court-appointed attorney Sarah Kim, coordinating fake witness testimony, and forging medical records using stolen information from my legitimate healthcare providers. The conspiracy involved felony crimes that could result in decades of prison time for everyone involved. As security officers approached their table, Patricia finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "We just needed the money, Your Honor. The gambling debts were destroying our retirement, and Calhoun was being selfish about helping his own parents. We never intended for things to go this far." But Judge Morrison was no longer interested in their explanations or justifications. The evidence clearly demonstrated a calculated conspiracy to destroy my constitutional rights, steal my assets, and potentially end my life if their fraud was discovered. The betrayal by my own parents was complete, but the truth was finally emerging after months of careful preparation and documentation. The transformation of the courtroom atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Within minutes of Officer Sullivan reading the evidence from my folder, courthouse security had detained Patricia, Gerald, and Sterling, while Judge Morrison contacted emergency law enforcement agencies to handle what had clearly become a complex criminal investigation rather than a simple family guardianship proceeding. Judge Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed the complete corruption of his courtroom by an elaborate criminal conspiracy. "I am immediately dismissing the guardianship petition and ordering the detention of all participants in this fraud pending formal criminal charges. This court has been used as an instrument of attempted theft, kidnapping, and potentially attempted murder." The FBI's white-collar crime unit arrived within 2 hours, having been contacted night hours when banks charge additional fees. Gerald explained tearfully that Patricia had followed me one evening watching as I entered an underground poker game in a warehouse district building. He came home at 4 in the morning, Your Honor, with his shirt torn and blood on his knuckles, Gerald testified. When we confronted him about his gambling, he became enraged and accused us of spying on him. That's when we realized the paranoia had become dangerous and we feared he might hurt himself or innocent people. Sterling then called Bradley Nash, supposedly a former colleague from Thornton Manufacturing, who provided damning testimony about my workplace behavior. Nash claimed I had become increasingly erratic over recent months, frequently talking to myself during engineering meetings and accusing other team members of sabotaging my projects. He described incidents where I allegedly sent threatening emails to supervisors and once barricaded myself in a supply closet for 3 hours, claiming someone was trying to poison the coffee in the break room. Calhoun stopped showering regularly and began wearing the same clothes multiple days in a row, Nash testified. His work quality deteriorated significantly, and he missed several important project deadlines because he was convinced our computers were infected with surveillance software. Management had been discussing termination procedures before he stopped showing up altogether. The medical records contained disturbing details that seemed impossible to fabricate. Dr. Reeves had allegedly prescribed specific medications, noted my weight and blood pressure during appointments, and documented my responses to various treatment approaches. The documentation appeared authentic, complete with official letterhead digital signatures and cross-references to other healthcare providers. But as Judge Morrison questioned the timeline of Dr. Reeves's alleged treatment, inconsistencies began emerging. The first appointment supposedly occurred on March 15th, but my actual medical records showed I was having a routine physical examination with my primary care physician, Dr. Thomas Hartwell, that same afternoon. The psychiatric notes referenced conversations about my workplace stress and relationship concerns, but contained specific details about my apartment layout and personal habits that I had only discussed with Dr. Hartwell during routine checkups. That's when the horrifying realization struck me. I recognized certain phrases and medical terminology that Dr. Hartwell had used during my last annual physical examination. The psychiatric evaluation had been crafted using information from my legitimate medical files, with fabricated mental health diagnoses seamlessly integrated throughout. My parents had somehow gained access to my actual healthcare records and used that private information to create convincing fake psychiatric documentation. Looking more closely at the documents Sterling was presenting, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the margins of several pages, there were handwritten notes supposedly made by Dr. Reeves during our sessions, but I recognized that handwriting immediately. It belonged to my mother. Patricia had been forging psychiatric notes using her own observations from visiting my apartment to create believable documentation of my alleged mental deterioration. The scope of their deception was breathtaking. They had stolen my medical privacy, fabricated an entire psychiatric history, and recruited witnesses to support their fictional narrative. Every private conversation I had ever had with my mother about work, stress, or relationship concerns had been twisted into evidence of severe mental illness, requiring immediate intervention. Sterling concluded his presentation by requesting immediate emergency guardianship, claiming I posed an imminent danger to myself and others. He recommended placement in a residential treatment facility where I could receive appropriate psychiatric care while my parents managed my financial affairs and living arrangements. Judge Morrison appeared genuinely concerned as he reviewed the extensive documentation, clearly struggling with the weight of evidence presented against my competency. The betrayal felt complete as I sat there helpless, to defend against months of calculated preparation designed to destroy my credibility and independence. My own intimate medical information had been weaponized against me by the people I trusted most in the world. Just when I thought the attacks on my character and sanity couldn't become more devastating, Sterling announced he had additional surprise witnesses whose testimony would provide crucial evidence about my declining mental state and dangerous behavior. The confidence in his voice suggested he held decisive ammunition that would end any remaining doubt about my incompetency. The first surprise witness was Eleanor Finch, an elderly woman who claimed to be my former landlord from the apartment I rented during my first 2 years after college graduation. She walked slowly to the witness stand using a decorative cane and wearing a floral dress that gave her the appearance of someone's kindly grandmother. Her testimony, however, was anything but kind. "Your Honor," Eleanor began in a shaky voice, "I rented my basement apartment to young Calhoun for 24 months, and I have never encountered a more destructive and unstable tenant in 40 years of property management. During what I can only describe as psychotic episodes, he would bang on the walls at all hours of the night, screaming about invisible people watching him through the windows." She produced photographs showing significant damage to what appeared to be a basement apartment, including holes punched in walls, broken light fixtures, and obscene graffiti scrawled across bathroom tiles. Eleanor testified that I had caused over $4,000 in damages during a single weekend rampage, forcing her to completely renovate the unit before finding new tenants. "I discovered he had been hoarding newspapers and empty food containers throughout the apartment, creating fire hazards and attracting rodents," Eleanor continued. "When I finally served him with eviction papers, he became violent and threatened to burn down my house if I didn't leave him alone. I had to obtain a restraining order and hire security guards during his moving day." The second surprise witness was Janet Wells, supposedly a bank teller from my credit union who had observed my erratic behavior during recent visits. Janet appeared nervous as she approached the witness stand, constantly adjusting her glasses and smoothing her conservative business suit. Her testimony painted me as increasingly agitated and potentially dangerous during routine banking transactions. Calhoun would arrive at our branch, talking rapidly to himself, and become enraged when asked for proper identification, Janet testified. During one incident last month, he accused our staff of being part of a conspiracy to steal his money and threatened to call the FBI if we didn't process his withdrawal immediately. He claimed our security cameras were being monitored by government agents who were tracking his financial activities. Janet described an incident where I allegedly grabbed her wrist when she asked me to provide additional verification for a large withdrawal leaving bruises that required medical attention. She claimed I'd been banned from entering the bank without a security escort after threatening violence against multiple employees who were simply following standard procedures. Patricia returned to the witness stand to provide additional testimony about my living conditions, describing my apartment as a disaster area that reflected my deteriorating mental state. She painted a picture of someone living in squalor, surrounded by evidence of paranoid delusions and self-destructive behavior. When I used my emergency key to check on Calhoun last week, I found newspapers stacked from floor to ceiling throughout his living room, Patricia testified tearfully. Empty takeout containers covered every surface, and he had taped aluminum foil over all the windows. The smell was overwhelming, and I discovered he had been urinating in empty bottles rather than using his bathroom because he believed someone had poisoned his water supply. Gerald provided the final devastating testimony describing disturbing phone calls I had allegedly made during the early morning hours, rambling incoherently about workplace surveillance and family conspiracies. He claimed I had become obsessed with the idea that everyone in my life was working together to destroy my career and steal my possessions. Calhoun called me at 3:15 in the morning last Tuesday, sobbing and claiming his coworkers had broken into his apartment to install listening devices, Gerald testified. He said he could hear voices coming through his heating vents and that someone was controlling his computer remotely to delete his engineering projects. The conversation lasted 2 hours, and he refused to believe me when I tried to convince him that these things weren't really happening. The accumulation of witness testimony created an overwhelming portrait of someone experiencing severe mental illness and posing genuine risks to himself and others. Judge Morrison's expression grew increasingly grave as each witness provided additional evidence of my alleged deterioration and dangerous behavior. But as I listened to Eleanor Finch's testimony, something triggered a memory that sent chills down my spine. I recognized her voice and mannerisms from somewhere completely unrelated to any landlord relationship. She was one of Patricia's bridge partners from their country club, someone I had met multiple times during family gatherings and holiday parties. My actual former landlord had been Robert Chen, a quiet man who had provided excellent references when I applied for my mortgage. The realization expanded as I studied Janet Wells more carefully. She worked at a completely different bank branch across town, nowhere near my credit union. I'd never seen her before in my life, yet she was providing detailed testimony about supposed interactions that had never occurred. These weren't random witnesses who happened to know me. They were friends and acquaintances of my parents who had agreed to commit perjury in support of their fraudulent guardianship case. The conspiracy reached far beyond what I had initially imagined. My parents had recruited an entire network of people willing to lie under oath, each playing specific roles designed to corroborate their fabricated narrative about my mental illness and dangerous behavior. Eleanor Finch was pretending to be my former landlord, Janet Wells was posing as a bank employee, and Bradley Nash was likely another friend coached to play the role of a concerned coworker. Sterling's smug confidence made perfect sense now. He wasn't just presenting isolated pieces of evidence. He was orchestrating a coordinated deception involving multiple participants who had rehearsed their testimonies to create a seamless web of lies. The photographs of apartment damage, the bank incident reports, and the workplace complaints were all fabricated props supporting their elaborate performance. As I counted the number of people willing to commit felony perjury to help my parents steal my assets and freedom, the scope of their betrayal felt overwhelming. At least 5 individuals had agreed to risk criminal prosecution to support this conspiracy, suggesting either significant financial incentives or long-standing loyalties that ran deeper than basic human decency. Judge Morrison appeared genuinely convinced by the mounting evidence against my competency, and I realized that without some way to expose the truth about these fake witnesses, I was facing the complete destruction of my independence and constitutional rights. My parents had constructed their case so carefully that even I was beginning to doubt my own perceptions of reality. My court-appointed attorney Sarah Kim sat beside me throughout the devastating testimony, her behavior becoming increasingly concerning as the case progressed against me. Rather than challenging the obvious inconsistencies in witness statements or questioning the authenticity of medical records, she appeared overwhelmed and unprepared to mount any meaningful defense against the coordinated attack on my competency. When Sterling presented the forged psychiatric records, Kim failed to request verification of Dr. Amanda Reeves's medical license or ask for contact information to schedule an independent evaluation. She accepted the documents at face value, never noting that the treatment timeline conflicted with my actual medical appointments or that the handwriting in the margins appeared suspicious. During Eleanor Finch's testimony about apartment damages, Kim should have requested lease agreements, security deposit records, or photographs from the actual rental period to verify the landlord relationship. Instead, she sat silently as Eleanor described events that never occurred in apartments I never rented. Kim's cross-examination consisted of 3 softball questions that allowed Eleanor to repeat her damaging testimony without challenge. "Mrs. Finch," Kim asked weakly, "were there any positive aspects of Mr. Calhoun's tenancy that you recall?" Eleanor seized the opportunity to provide additional harmful testimony. "I tried to be patient with his condition, dear, but the property damage and threatening behavior made it impossible to maintain a landlord-tenant relationship. I actually feared for my personal safety during our final interactions." Kim's handling of Janet Wells's banking testimony was equally ineffective. She never asked for documentation of the alleged incidents, employee reports, or security camera footage that would exist if violent confrontations had actually occurred at a financial institution. Kim allowed Janet to describe threatening behavior and physical assault without requesting police reports or medical records that would have been generated by such serious incidents. When Gerald testified about my supposed late-night phone calls filled with paranoid delusions, Kim failed to subpoena phone records that would have proven those conversations never took place. She never asked for specific dates, times, or witness verification of the alleged calls. Her cross-examination was limited to asking Gerald if he was concerned about my well-being, which only provided him another opportunity to express parental worry about my deteriorating mental state. Judge Morrison began expressing serious concern about the extensive evidence against my competency, noting that multiple independent witnesses had corroborated my parents' claims about dangerous and erratic behavior. He praised the thoroughness of Sterling's case presentation while questioning Kim's lack of substantive defense on my behalf. Ms. Kim, Judge Morrison said your client faces serious allegations supported by medical records, witness testimony, and documented incidents. Do you have evidence to contradict these claims or character witnesses who can speak to Mr. Calhoun's mental stability and responsible behavior? Kim stammered through a response that suggested she had conducted minimal preparation for my defense. Your Honor, my client maintains that he is competent to manage his own affairs, but given the extensive documentation presented today, perhaps we should consider a graduated guardianship arrangement that would provide appropriate oversight while preserving some degree of independence. Her suggestion felt like a complete capitulation to my parents' demands. Rather than fighting the fraudulent case against me, Kim was negotiating the terms of my surrender. I wanted to object to demand a more aggressive defense, but I had been warned repeatedly that speaking out of turn could be interpreted as additional evidence of my unstable mental state. During a brief recess, Patricia broke into convincing sobs as she approached the bench to speak directly with Judge Morrison. She begged the court to provide help for her troubled son before he hurt himself or innocent people, expressing genuine maternal concern that appeared completely authentic to observers who didn't know about her elaborate deception. Gerald presented a detailed care plan involving supervised living arrangements and comprehensive medical treatment, claiming they had already researched placement options at Sunset Manor, a residential facility specializing in adults with severe mental disabilities. The care plan included medication management structured daily activities and gradual reintroduction to independent living skills under professional supervision. Your Honor, Gerald pleaded, we're not asking for permanent control over our son's life. We simply want him to receive the help he desperately needs before his condition deteriorates further. Sunset Manor has excellent treatment outcomes, and their staff specializes in cases exactly like Calhoun's. We've spoken with their admission coordinator, and they have an opening available immediately. The mention of immediate placement at a residential facility sent waves of panic through my entire body. I realized that if Judge Morrison granted their guardianship petition, I could be institutionalized within hours, separated from my apartment, my job, and any ability to fight their conspiracy. The care plan they had developed would effectively end my independent existence while providing legal justification for their actions. During the recess, I desperately needed to speak with Kim about mounting a stronger defense. But when I approached her in the hallway outside the courtroom, I overheard a conversation that shattered my last hope for legal representation. Kim was speaking quietly with Sterling near the water fountain, their voices low but audible enough for me to catch fragments of their discussion. Don't worry about the cross-examination, Kim was saying. I'll make sure he doesn't fight this too hard. Patricia promised the final payment will be transferred tonight once the guardianship is approved. Just stick to the timeline we discussed. Sterling nodded and responded. The judge is clearly convinced by the medical evidence. As long as you don't raise any serious objections to our witness testimony, we should have the guardianship order signed before 5 o'clock. Your cooperation has been essential to making this work. The devastating realization hit me like a physical blow. My own court-appointed attorney had been bribed by my parents to sabotage my defense. Kim was supposed to be protecting my constitutional rights and fighting against their fraudulent case, but instead she was actively participating in the conspiracy to steal my freedom and assets. When Kim returned to our table, she advised me to accept the guardianship arrangement for my own good, claiming that fighting against such overwhelming evidence would only make my situation worse. She suggested that cooperation would demonstrate insight into my mental health needs and potentially lead to a faster restoration of my rights once I completed treatment. "Calhoun," she said with fake sincerity, "I know this feels overwhelming, but your parents genuinely want to help you. The evidence against your competency is substantial, and Judge Morrison seems inclined to grant their petition. If you work with the system instead of fighting it, you'll have a much better chance of regaining your independence down the road." Her betrayal felt complete as I realized that everyone involved in the legal process had been compromised by my parents' conspiracy. The witnesses were lying, the medical records were forged, and even my own attorney was working against my interests for financial compensation. I was facing the complete destruction of my constitutional rights with no legal representation and no apparent way to expose the truth about their elaborate fraud. Sitting in that courtroom, surrounded by lies and betrayal, I felt completely defeated as the walls of my parents' conspiracy closed in around me. The evidence against my competency appeared overwhelming to Judge Morrison, who seemed genuinely concerned about approving guardianship for someone exhibiting such serious mental health symptoms and dangerous behavior. But as devastating as their attack had been, I hadn't revealed my most crucial cards yet. For months I'd suspected that my parents were planning something destructive. Their cold treatment after I refused their loan request, combined with the obvious surveillance and whispered conversations at family gatherings, had triggered defensive instincts I didn't even know I possessed. While they were busy constructing their elaborate fraud, I had been quietly documenting their behavior and gathering evidence of my own. "Your Honor," I said, rising from my chair despite Kim's attempts to keep me seated, "I request permission to present character witnesses who can speak to my mental stability and responsible behavior over the past several years." Judge Morrison appeared surprised by my sudden assertiveness, given Kim's previous suggestions that I was too impaired to participate meaningfully in my own defense. After consulting his scheduling requirements, he reluctantly agreed to hear brief testimony from witnesses I had prepared, warning that any further delays would need compelling justification. My first witness was Derek Martinez, my direct supervisor at Thornton Manufacturing, who contradicted Bradley Nash's earlier testimony about my workplace performance and behavior. Derek took the witness stand with obvious reluctance, clearly uncomfortable being involved in family legal proceedings, but committed to providing truthful testimony about my professional conduct. "Your Honor," Derek began, "I've supervised Calhoun's work for the past 3 years, and I can state without reservation that he's one of our most reliable and competent engineers. His attendance record is perfect. His project completions are consistently ahead of schedule, and his technical innovations have saved our company over $50,000 in manufacturing costs." Derek produced performance evaluations, attendance records, and project completion reports that painted a picture completely opposite to the workplace dysfunction described by Nash. He explained that I had received 2 promotions during my tenure and was being considered for advanced training in hydraulic system design opportunities, reserved for employees demonstrating exceptional stability and professional judgment. Just last week, Derek testified, Calhoun presented a design modification to our engineering team that solved a recurring pressure valve problem we'd been struggling with for months. His presentation was clear, well organized, and demonstrated the kind of innovative thinking we value most in our senior staff members. I've never observed any signs of mental instability or concerning behavior during our professional interactions. My second character witness was Mrs. Dorothy Vaughn, my elderly neighbor, who had observed my daily routines and personal conduct for the past 2 years since I moved into the downtown apartment. Mrs. Vaughn walked carefully to the witness stand, her silver hair perfectly arranged and her floral dress pressed for the formal occasion. Despite her age, her mind was sharp and her observations detailed. "Young man," she said, looking directly at me with grandmotherly affection, "I've lived in that building for 15 years, and Calhoun is the most considerate and responsible neighbor I've ever encountered. He helps me carry groceries up 2 flights of stairs every Sunday after church, and he's never once asked for anything in return." Mrs. Vaughn described my apartment as immaculate during her visits, contradicting Patricia's testimony about newspapers and garbage cluttering my living space. She mentioned my regular volunteer work at the Denver Animal Shelter every Saturday morning, where I helped with dog walking and facility maintenance. Her testimony painted a picture of someone deeply connected to his community and committed to helping others. "I've watched Calhoun's daily routines for 2 years," Mrs. Vaughn continued, "and I've never seen any evidence of the concerning behavior described by previous witnesses. He leaves for work at the same time every morning, maintains his apartment beautifully, and treats everyone in our building with kindness and respect." When my grandson visited last Christmas, Calhoun spent an entire afternoon teaching him how to change a bicycle tire. But the most important moment came when I requested permission to present physical evidence that I had been collecting for months. I produced a manila folder from my briefcase explaining to Judge Morrison that I had suspected my parents' intentions and begun documenting their behavior when their treatment of me became suspicious and threatening. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal, "I suspected that my parents were planning legal action against me after their behavior changed dramatically following my refusal to provide them with a $15,000 loan. I began recording our conversations and documenting their activities to protect myself against potential false accusations." Judge Morrison examined the folder with obvious curiosity, noting that it contained recorded phone conversations, printed emails, photographs, and handwritten notes that appeared to document a pattern of behavior spanning several months. Sterling's confident smirk finally wavered as he realized that I had been conducting my own investigation while he was building his fraudulent case. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Morrison said, "I'm going to review this evidence before proceeding with my guardianship decision. If these documents contain information relevant to the competency proceedings, they must be considered as part of the complete record." The folder represented months of careful preparation, documenting every suspicious conversation, every contradiction in my parents' behavior, and every piece of evidence that suggested they were planning something destructive. I had learned to be suspicious of their motivations, and that defensive preparation was about to save my freedom and independence. Kim appeared genuinely shocked that I had gathered evidence without consulting her clearly, unaware that her own betrayal had been anticipated and documented as part of my broader investigation. Sterling requested a brief recess to review the materials, but Judge Morrison denied the delay, stating that the proceedings had already consumed more time than originally scheduled. "We'll examine this evidence now," Judge Morrison declared. "Bailiff Sullivan, please open the folder and read the first 3 items aloud for the court record." As Officer James Sullivan approached my folder, I felt a mixture of terror and vindication. The evidence I was about to present would either save my life or confirm my parents' characterization of me as paranoid and delusional. Everything depended on whether Judge Morrison would recognize the truth behind months of calculated deception and betrayal. Officer James Sullivan opened my folder with the careful attention required for potential evidence in legal proceedings, his expression neutral as he began reviewing the contents. The courtroom fell completely silent as Judge Morrison waited for the bailiff to examine the materials and provide an initial assessment of their relevance to the guardianship case. "Your Honor," Sullivan announced, "the first item appears to be a transcript of a recorded telephone conversation between the petitioners dated 6 weeks ago." He cleared his throat and began reading from the document, in a clear, official voice that carried throughout the courtroom. Patricia Calhoun speaking on October 15th at 9:47 p.m. Quote, Gerald, "We need to finalize the medical records before we file the paperwork. I've been working on Dr. Reeves's notes, but we need to make sure the handwriting looks consistent throughout the evaluation reports. Did you get the bank statements modified to show the gambling withdrawals?" End quote. Sterling jumped to his feet, objecting to the admission of evidence that hadn't been properly authenticated or verified for legal proceedings. But Judge Morrison waved him back to his seat, clearly intrigued by the implications of what Sullivan had just read. Patricia's face had gone completely pale, and Gerald was staring at the folder like it contained explosives. "Continue reading Officer Sullivan," Judge Morrison instructed. "Let's hear the complete conversation." Sullivan continued with Gerald's recorded response. Quote, "The bank statements are finished, and Marcus Webb delivered the final surveillance report this morning. Bradley knows what to say when he testifies, and Eleanor has been practicing her landlord story. The only problem is that court-appointed attorney. She's asking for more money than we originally agreed to pay her." End quote. The recording continued with Patricia's reply, quote, "Pay whatever Sarah Kim demands. We need her to sabotage his defense completely or this whole plan falls apart. Once we get the guardianship approved, we'll have access to his entire savings account plus the apartment equity. We can afford to be generous with our co-conspirators." End quote. Judge Morrison's expression transformed from curious interest to shocked recognition as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Sterling was frantically shuffling through papers, clearly unprepared to defend against evidence of the elaborate fraud he had been helping to orchestrate. Gerald had buried his face in his hands, while Patricia sat frozen in her chair like a deer caught in headlights. "Officer Sullivan," Judge Morrison said grimly, "please read the second item." The second document contained printed screenshots of email correspondence between Gerald and Marcus Webb, the private investigator who had been conducting surveillance on my daily activities. Sullivan read the exchanges that revealed detailed planning of the fraudulent evidence gathering and coordination between multiple participants in the conspiracy. Email from Gerald Calhoun to Marcus Webb, dated September 28th. Quote, "We need surveillance photos that can be interpreted as evidence of paranoid behavior and social isolation. Focus on capturing images when he's alone, preferably looking over his shoulder or appearing agitated. The bank has agreed to provide modified statements showing large cash withdrawals during late-night hours." End quote. Webb's response email was equally damning. Quote, "I've been documenting his routine for 6 weeks now. The subject maintains normal daily patterns, but I can photograph him from angles that suggest suspicious behavior. Eleanor Finch has agreed to pose as his former landlord, and I'm preparing damaged apartment photos from a separate property to support her testimony. The subject appears stable and responsible, so we'll need to be creative with our evidence presentation." End quote. Judge Morrison was visibly disturbed by the evidence of coordinated perjury and fraud, but Sullivan's announcement of the third item caused him to recoil physically and immediately call for courtroom security. The bailiff's voice carried a note of shock as he described what he was seeing. "Your Honor," Sullivan said, his professional composure shaken, "the third item is a handwritten document that appears to outline plans for long-term institutionalization and permanent asset seizure. The writing matches previous samples from Patricia Calhoun, and the content describes intentions that go far beyond standard guardianship arrangements." Sullivan began reading Patricia's handwritten plan, which detailed not just the immediate guardianship fraud, but their long-term strategy for maintaining complete control over my life indefinitely. The document revealed plans to have me declared permanently incompetent and committed to a psychiatric facility where I would remain under heavy medication to ensure docility and compliance. Quote, "Once the guardianship is approved, we'll sell his apartment immediately and transfer the proceeds to our retirement account. The savings account funds will cover our gambling debts and cryptocurrency losses." We've researched long-term care facilities that accept patients with severe mental illness, and Sunset Manor has agreed to keep him indefinitely as long as we continue making monthly payments." End quote. The most shocking revelation came in Patricia's notes about medication management. Quote, "Dr. Harrison at Sunset Manor confirmed that patients receiving high doses of antipsychotic medications rarely recover enough cognitive function to challenge their commitment orders. We'll need to ensure Calhoun's treatment includes maximum sedation levels to prevent him from attempting legal action or contacting outside advocates who might question his diagnosis." End quote. Judge Morrison stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger, as he realized the true scope of the conspiracy. "Bailiff, call for immediate security presence in this courtroom. We're dealing with attempted kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy charges that require immediate detention of the primary participants." Patricia and Gerald sat frozen as courthouse security officers entered the room, clearly understanding that their elaborate scheme had collapsed completely. Sterling was rapidly packing his briefcase, apparently hoping to distance himself from his clients before the full legal consequences became clear. Quote, "If necessary, we can arrange for Calhoun to have an accident during his transport to Sunset Manor." Patricia's notes continued. "Dr. Harrison mentioned that patients sometimes experience adverse reactions to initial medication doses, especially when combined with anxiety about their new living arrangements. An overdose could be explained as suicide attempt by someone unable to accept their mental health diagnosis." End quote. The final revelation caused several people in the courtroom to gasp audibly. My parents hadn't just been planning to steal my assets and freedom. They had been considering murdering me if their institutionalization plan encountered legal challenges. The scope of their betrayal extended beyond financial fraud into potential homicide. Judge Morrison was calling for additional security personnel and requesting immediate contact with law enforcement agencies specializing in fraud and conspiracy cases. Sterling had abandoned his clients entirely, walking quickly toward the courtroom exit, while Patricia and Gerald remained seated, apparently too shocked to move or speak. Officer Sullivan continued reading through additional evidence in my folder, including recorded conversations where my parents discussed bribing court-appointed attorney Sarah Kim, coordinating fake witness testimony, and forging medical records using stolen information from my legitimate healthcare providers. The conspiracy involved felony crimes that could result in decades of prison time for everyone involved. As security officers approached their table, Patricia finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "We just needed the money, Your Honor. The gambling debts were destroying our retirement, and Calhoun was being selfish about helping his own parents. We never intended for things to go this far." But Judge Morrison was no longer interested in their explanations or justifications. The evidence clearly demonstrated a calculated conspiracy to destroy my constitutional rights, steal my assets, and potentially end my life if their fraud was discovered. The betrayal by my own parents was complete, but the truth was finally emerging after months of careful preparation and documentation. The transformation of the courtroom atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Within minutes of Officer Sullivan reading the evidence from my folder, courthouse security had detained Patricia, Gerald, and Sterling, while Judge Morrison contacted emergency law enforcement agencies to handle what had clearly become a complex criminal investigation rather than a simple family guardianship proceeding. Judge Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed the complete corruption of his courtroom by an elaborate criminal conspiracy. "I am immediately dismissing the guardianship petition and ordering the detention of all participants in this fraud pending formal criminal charges. This court has been used as an instrument of attempted theft, kidnapping, and potentially attempted murder." The FBI's white-collar crime unit arrived within 2 hours, having been contacted directly from Judge Morrison's chambers. Special Agent Rebecca Torres took charge of the investigation, coordinating with local law enforcement to secure evidence and interview witnesses. The scope of the conspiracy expanded rapidly as investigators discovered the network of fraudulent documentation and perjured testimony that my parents had orchestrated. Dr. Amanda Reeves, the psychiatrist whose identity had been used to create my fake medical records, turned out never to have existed. The medical license number belonged to Dr. Amanda Richardson, a psychiatrist who had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. Patricia had stolen the deceased doctor's credentials and used them to forge an entire psychiatric evaluation history. The identity theft charges alone carried federal penalties of up to 15 years in prison. Sarah Kim's law license was permanently revoked within 48 hours after she confessed to accepting bribes totaling $12,000 in exchange for sabotaging my legal defense. She faced disbarment proceedings, criminal charges for conspiracy and fraud, and civil lawsuits from other clients whose cases may have been compromised by her corrupt practices. Kim's confession provided crucial evidence about the scope of my parents' planning and the specific instructions she had received to ensure my defeat in court. Eleanor Finch, who had posed as my former landlord, received an 18-month prison sentence after pleading guilty to perjury and conspiracy charges. Her testimony about apartment damages and threatening behavior had been completely fabricated with photographs taken from a separate property that had been damaged by different tenants entirely. Finch admitted that Patricia had offered her $5,000 plus legal fees to provide false testimony. Janet Wells faced similar charges for posing as a bank employee and providing perjured testimony about my alleged violent behavior during financial transactions. The real Janet Wells worked at a completely different financial institution and had never encountered me. The woman who testified was actually Janet Morrison, Patricia's cousin from Colorado Springs, who had agreed to participate in the conspiracy in exchange for help with her own gambling debts. Bradley Nash, who had testified about my supposed workplace dysfunction, was revealed to be Gerald's golfing partner from their country club. Nash had never worked at Thornton Manufacturing or any engineering firm. His detailed testimony about my alleged erratic behavior and threatening emails had been scripted entirely by my parents and rehearsed during multiple practice sessions. Nash received a 2-year prison sentence and permanent exclusion from testifying in any future legal proceedings. Marcus Webb's private investigation license was permanently revoked, and he faced multiple felony charges for fabricating surveillance reports and participating in the conspiracy to defraud. Webb's legitimate business was destroyed as other clients discovered that their cases may have involved falsified evidence and fraudulent documentation. He ultimately received a 4-year prison sentence and was required to pay restitution to all clients who had relied on his corrupt investigative services. The most serious charges were reserved for Patricia and Gerald, whose conspiracy involved attempted kidnapping through fraudulent commitment proceedings, identity theft, forgery, perjury, and conspiracy to commit murder based on Patricia's written plans for causing my death if their institutionalization scheme was challenged. The federal prosecutor's office pursued the case aggressively, recognizing that the conspiracy threatened fundamental constitutional protections for all citizens. During the trial, additional evidence emerged about the scope of their planning. Patricia and Gerald had been researching guardianship fraud techniques for over 6 months, studying cases where adult children had been successfully declared incompetent and institutionalized against their will. They had contacted multiple psychiatric facilities to identify institutions willing to accept long-term patients with questionable diagnoses in exchange for steady monthly payments. The financial investigation revealed that Patricia's gambling losses exceeded $40,000 over the past year, while Gerald's cryptocurrency investments had cost them their entire retirement savings. Their mortgage payments were 3 months behind, and they faced foreclosure proceedings on their house. The guardianship fraud had been motivated by desperate financial circumstances but their solution involved destroying their own son's life to solve their self-created problems. Patricia and Gerald ultimately received 8-year federal prison sentences with additional state charges for conspiracy fraud and attempted kidnapping. Their house and remaining assets were seized to pay restitution legal fees and damages. The retirement accounts they had hoped to restore through stealing my assets were liquidated to compensate me for emotional distress, legal expenses, and the temporary loss of my constitutional rights. Judge Morrison issued a formal apology on behalf of the court system, acknowledging that the guardianship process had been corrupted by criminal activity and expressing admiration for my foresight in documenting the conspiracy against me. He recommended changes to guardianship procedures that would require independent verification of medical records and witness testimony to prevent similar fraud in the future. The experience taught me profound lessons about trust-family relationships and personal resilience that transformed my understanding of human nature and moral responsibility. I realized that blood relationships provide no guarantee of love, loyalty, or ethical behavior. True family consists of people who support your growth, independence, and well-being, rather than those who share your genetic inheritance. The betrayal by my own parents forced me to develop emotional strength I never knew I possessed. While the initial shock and pain felt overwhelming, the process of defending myself against their conspiracy revealed capabilities for strategic thinking, evidence gathering, and psychological endurance that served me well in subsequent challenges throughout my life. Derek Martinez, my supervisor who had testified on my behalf, became a close friend and mentor as I processed the trauma of family betrayal. His willingness to support me during the legal proceedings, despite personal risk and professional inconvenience, demonstrated the kind of authentic loyalty that my parents had pretended to offer. Derek's friendship became more valuable to me than any family relationship I had ever experienced. Mrs. Dorothy Vaughn, my elderly neighbor who had also testified truthfully about my character and behavior, became like a surrogate grandmother to me. Her observations about my daily routines and community involvement had provided crucial credibility to counter my parents' fabricated narrative. I continued helping her with household tasks and grocery shopping, but our relationship evolved into genuine mutual affection and support. I used part of the financial settlement from my parents' asset seizure to establish the Adult Guardianship Defense Fund, a nonprofit organization that provides legal assistance to individuals facing questionable competency proceedings. Working with elder law attorneys and disability rights advocates, we created resources to help families recognize guardianship abuse and defend against fraudulent petitions. The organization has successfully prevented dozens of similar conspiracies and helped restore rights to people who were victimized by corrupt guardianship proceedings. The experience also motivated me to strengthen my professional relationships and community connections, recognizing that isolation makes people vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. I joined the Denver Engineering Society, became active in neighborhood association activities, and developed friendships with colleagues who could provide character references if I ever faced similar challenges in the future. My career at Thornton Manufacturing flourished as I channeled the energy from surviving family trauma into professional excellence and innovation. The promotion I received 6 months after the trial included supervisory responsibilities and advanced project management duties. I eventually started my own engineering consulting firm, specializing in hydraulic systems for construction equipment, with Derek Martinez as my business partner. The relationship with my parents ended completely after their conviction and imprisonment. I maintained no contact during their incarceration and declined their requests for visits or correspondence. While some family members and friends suggested that forgiveness would help me heal emotionally, I recognized that true healing required protecting myself from people who had demonstrated willingness to destroy my life for financial gain. The therapeutic process helped me understand that my parents' betrayal reflected their own character defects rather than any failure on my part to be a worthy son. Their gambling addictions, financial irresponsibility, and moral corruption had existed long before I refused their loan request. My decision to maintain financial boundaries had simply triggered their decision to pursue criminal alternatives rather than addressing their problems through legitimate means. 10 years later, I can honestly say that surviving my parents' conspiracy made me a stronger, more compassionate, and more resilient person. The experience taught me to value authentic relationships, recognize manipulation and deception, and appreciate the legal protections that preserve individual freedom and dignity in American society. While the betrayal caused tremendous pain and trauma, it ultimately revealed strengths and capabilities that have enriched every aspect of my subsequent life. I married a wonderful woman named Jessica, whom I met through volunteer work at the animal shelter, where Mrs. Vaughn had encouraged me to maintain my community involvement. Jessica's family embraced me with the genuine love and support that my biological parents had never provided. Our relationship is built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect rather than obligation or genetic connection. We now have 2 children who will grow up understanding that family loyalty must be earned through consistent love and support rather than demanded based on blood relationships. I plan to teach them about financial responsibility, ethical decision-making, and the importance of maintaining personal boundaries with people who demonstrate harmful intentions regardless of their family status. The Denver community where I built my independent life became my true home, filled with neighbors, colleagues, and friends who supported me during the most difficult period of my life. The apartment that my parents tried to steal remains my sanctuary, a symbol of personal achievement and independence that no one can take away through fraud or deception. Looking back on that terrifying day in court, when I thought I would lose everything I had worked for, I realized that the experience ultimately gave me far more than it threatened to take away. The conspiracy forced me to discover inner strength, build authentic relationships, and develop a deeper appreciation for justice, truth, and constitutional protections that many people take for granted. The most important lesson I learned is that surviving betrayal by people who claim to love you reveals your true capacity for resilience, wisdom, and emotional growth. While I would never choose to experience such trauma again, I'm grateful for the person it helped me become and the meaningful life I was able to build in its aftermath. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely was working against your best interests? I'd love to hear your thoughts on how people can protect themselves from family members who might exploit their trust and loyalty. Please like this video if my story resonated with you, subscribe for more content about overcoming personal betrayals and building resilience, and share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding how guardianship fraud works and how to defend against it. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you recognize the difference between people who genuinely care about your well-being and those who only pretend to love you while pursuing their own selfish interests. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that you're less capable or worthy than you know yourself to be.